Okay, let me get us started. My name is Bill Clark. I'm a professor here at the Kennedy School and your host for the next hour. What we're facing here is the challenge that the issue of sustainability faces all the time, which is it seems to everybody, like the 80 people who signed up for this session, to be a really good idea. But when it comes down to that would actually mean getting up in the morning or hurrying up with breakfast or whatever. All the times I've testified to Congress about this issue, it's been yeah, but this is for posterity. Every time I've testified in Congress on this, they've scheduled it at 8:30, and you can, so this is the fate of sustainable development. In any event, thank you for coming. What I will try to do is give you a whirlwind tour of where that topic is playing out around the world, at least through the eyes of people who live in Cambridge. Start us out a generation ago, when most of us were younger. The third of the great world commissions that were held in the 1980s was on this theme. The first two had been the famous Palma and Brandt commissions on armaments and on poverty alleviation, respectively. But at the end of those two ventures, the people running these big multilateral international shows concluded that they had left one thing out, which was that they couldn't get security, whether it was of hunger or of people from disruption and refugees and migrants and so on, unless they also brought the environment into the equation. They were beginning to be faced with what, by today's standard, looked like mere ripples, small damages and perturbations to the environment, but for them was conscious enough that under the chairmanship of Gro Harlem Brundtland, then the chief of Norway, but also an alum of the Harvard School of Public Health, ran a commission that concluded, as quoted here, this is simple. The environment is where we live, development is what we do in trying to improve our lives, to get to prosperity, that the two are inseparable. Talking about them separately made no sense. They concluded, after a pretty dismal account of the state of the world, that nonetheless humanity has the ability to make development sustainable, to direct it in ways that it meets the needs of present generations without undermining the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So what I want to do is take us on a little tour of what's happened in the generation since this gauntlet was thrown down to the international community to figure out, well, if it has the ability to make things work, how are we doing it? In the intervening 30-ish years, there has certainly been an increase of talk about sustainable development. That's not a trivial thing. Most of the big new ideas of the 1980s you've never heard of. They had their 5 minutes in the sunshine and went away. That hasn't been true of the sustainability idea. We've had 3 world summits on it. It has collectively brought together more heads of state than the summits on any other topic, financial, military, what have you. It's also something that's, even in my own work, I can find being talked about in national capitals and boardrooms, but I also find talked about in the tiniest villages I go visit in Indonesia, in Kenya, and the like. There is something to this idea about doing well for one's kids today, but not messing up the future of one's grandchildren, that resonates with people pretty independent of where they've come from, what they're doing, how rich or poor they are, and so forth. So the fact that everybody's talking about it, even if they're talking about it in different ways, is a good thing. Scholars have, of course, leapt into the morass and have generated an almost infinite quantity of graphs, all of which have roughly the same shape. They're either going up very steeply or down very steeply. Usually up if it's human pressures on the environment, and usually down if it's the environment. And we could do not just a session here, but 6 courses on simply inventorying through that data, and thankfully for you, I'm not going to do that. What we see, though, as one stands back from the individual numbers and studies and so on, is just a growing concern about environmental degradation that current efforts to improve human well-being are doing. These are figures out of the recent climate reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, but you've been seeing in the headlines over the last couple of weeks reports out on the US situation, the vulnerability to floods and agricultural damage, but this is resonating around the world. So people are sounding the alarm. They're sounding it more loudly than they were a generation ago. But we still have we've been facing the challenge that has only begun to be resolved in the last decade or so. That with all this talk and all these numbers, there's still a lot of fuzziness about the concept of sustainable development. It tends to be a tent that everyone gathers under, and almost anything counts as being something pushed that way. That, again, is not necessarily a bad thing, but it opens the doors to greenwashing, to people simply putting the obligatory paragraph in whatever their declaration is, and not much accountability, not much ability to focus, whether it's a corporate agenda or a national set of policies, because we have found the idea so much in stress. And what I want to argue today is that that is a thing that's changed since a generation ago. That today we have a widely shared, increasingly widely shared vision of how folks ought to think about what is sustainable development and what is not, about what are the underlying determinants of sustainable development, and using that framework and ability to focus much more precisely than we've been able to do in the past over what are the big threats to it. Now, different people would give you a different account of that. What I'm going to do is give you an account, since you're sitting here at Harvard, that is approximately the one that I inflict on my students here. I've just finished teaching a group of undergraduates a course in sustainable development that is about trying to think clearly and across the disciplinary silos of academia about what's going on in the world around them and what role they might play in changing it. The previous semester, I taught a somewhat different course here at the Kennedy School on policy analysis and design for sustainable development, and I jump in a greenhouse gas emitting airplane tomorrow to go off to teach a short course for early career professionals in Europe, bringing students from China and Brazil and around the world together on the same issues. That is, the appetite for frameworks of thinking about sustainable development is there. So I'll introduce you to the framework, which is at a level anybody could use it for themselves. What's an intellectually defensible vision of what sustainability is, what determines it, and then my own cut at what most threatens it today. A short list, not the very long list. Then turn to an action agenda, because far too often in academia, we talk about all the things that are wrong, but not the things that could and should be done. And again, I'll give you a flavor that happens to be my own cut on that, but is one I think you would find reflected in the current conversations going on at the United Nations, in corporate boardrooms, in communities around the world. And finally, close a little bit with who's supposed to do all this stuff. Who is doing it today, who is setting the role models, but what kind of challenges does that pose for people like me and people like you? And we're going to get through all that in 45 minutes, right? Okay, so a framework. What I want to argue here is that though you could look at sustainability many ways, I want to start us at the top with what are we trying to accomplish, and pick up from the Brundtland Commission's idea of we're trying to improve the well-being of people around the world over the long run and everywhere. Basically, you want prosperity. You want to alleviate poverty. You want people like us to get better off than we are in ways that matter to us. And we want to do so in ways that we don't get our prosperity at the cost of chucking the garbage over the fence into our neighbors' lots or poking it into the future so that our grandkids have to deal with it. And I'll come back around to that in a second. I then want to trace down to the bottom of this about, well, what is our ability to create that kind of sustainable prosperity depend on? And I'm going to use the following image a couple of times through the talk. Imagine, as I will be tomorrow, you are on a plane flying across a big hunk of ocean. There are 3 pieces of data you should be worrying about, 2 of which they show you, which is up on those little screens that give you your trajectory where your airplane is flying, and you look at it and say, well, it seems to be going in the right direction. That's about where I want to be. You sometimes, especially on long flights, look at the ground speed and make sure how much you want to curse the headwinds and so on. But you sort of look and we're making reasonable length. The third piece of data is one you assume that the pilot is taking care of, but is the sustainability indicator. Is this progress and direction being made in a way that leaves enough gas in the tank that doesn't end you up waving at the Azores as you spiral down into the ocean? That is, are you making your progress today without depleting the fundamental resources on which your successful completion of this trip and your grandchildren's future depends? So sustainability is about, for sure, today's speed and direction. Are we getting the well-being we want? But it is also, and much differently than the kinds of economic accounts that are generally kept today, it's also about some notion of what's the fuel in the tank. Is that going down too fast or in ways that we cannot sustain our direction and our rate of speed into the future? And what I'll try to do down here is unpack for you what that image of fuel in the gas tank might actually be in the real world of sustainable development. And then I'll talk a little bit about the connective tissue. That is, how do we connect the gas tank to the direction and speed we want in order to get somewhere. So, plunge in at the beginning. The emergence of this notion of sustainable development not being about environmental protection as an end in itself, but being about improving human well-being as an end in itself, and environmental protection as one of the means for accomplishing that, was, as I said, latent in the original Brundtland report a generation ago, but has been fleshed out over the years by people like Amartya Sen, our Nobel Prize-winning philosopher and economist here at Harvard, but also today appears in the establishment journals of the World Bank, the UN community, and so on. And talking about well-being ultimately as people's capability, their ability to shape a life they want to live, not that somebody else defines for them, but that we find that for almost everyone around the world, as we do surveys on this and so on, that includes some of the obvious stuff. Meet their material needs, the original focus of Brundtland, food, housing, energy, water, health, creates healthy people, people with an education which helps them realize their objectives, people with a sense of community, people with a sense of physical security. You can fill in that list the way you would. But the, and I guess the OECD countries, so the industrialized plus countries, have begun to actually survey this systematically. One had found the 11 indicators down the side there are dimensions of well-being that pop up across countries, across social groups, across income groups. And they've begun to do systematic surveys on which countries feel most intensely about the weights that should be put on each of those things. Those are the different sizes of the rosettes. And then scoring them as to how well people think they're doing. And here's poor Turkey, and sorry, Mexico, down towards the bottom, even behind Chile, which is ridiculous. Brazil, the US falls somewhere in this vacuous middle ground that I just couldn't fit. And up at the top, some of the reasonable, usual suspects of Canada and Sweden and Norway, also Australia, Switzerland, and so forth and so on. The point is not that you need to believe these numbers, but the fact that we have now regularized the measurement of well-being, recognizing variations in what counts as well-being across countries, and recognize that different countries are achieving different degrees of it. Okay? So that's all. And that was a set of metrics and concepts we did not have even 10 years ago that we could systematically compare progress on. If I go back to it, though, the crucial thing about the vision of sustainable development, again, as framed by Brundtland and her colleagues, is not just your well-being, but the well-being of sort of everybody. So that we are not letting your well-being go up as simply because you threw your garbage over the fence to your neighbors in poorer countries that take your electronic waste, or threw your garbage over the fence into the future, who's going to have to deal with your climate change. So the concept of inclusive well-being that's emerged as the metric for sustainability is at least the thought experiment of saying, imagine we ran this world forward for 50 years, measured how well each person and each country is doing in each year, and summed that up. Okay? And if that number, that well-being, is not going down, our development has been sustainable. If it goes down over that period, our development isn't sustainable. And you can worry about how much you weight future generations versus present ones, or people on the other side of the world versus you. But the thought experiment is it's everybody's well-being who matters. And we need to therefore think about when it is that raising my own sense of well-being, security, community, and education complements that of others, versus whether it is at the expense of others. And the mechanics of doing that are obviously hard. But the ethics of it are fundamental, and they are radically different than the way we keep national economic and performance accounts today. So let me leave that on the table for the moment, and bring us down to the other end. If, for the moment, you'll buy into a notion of well-being defined roughly like inclusive well-being, well-being of everybody summed up over a bunch of things, what it is, what determines it? And many of you in your first econ class or something will have heard of people saying, well, how well-off nations are, at least, is some function of land, labor, and capital, their basic underlying resources. And that's been extended in different ways by efforts at the World Bank and national economic authorities to where we have a more sophisticated notion. It's not just people as labor, but people as healthy people, people as well-educated people, but still thinking of people as an input to sort of a national production function. We've thought more systematically about the role of knowledge, of good social institutions. It's more recently that we've begun to understand that land isn't just how much land you've got to grow food on, but is a whole set of natural capital assets that stabilize your climate, clear the toxins that you produce in your manufacturing, stabilize coastlines versus, again, storms by having trees grow on them, and so on. So what we have today is a vastly extended vision of the old land, labor, and capital, but still something that is in the same pattern of thought. It is not radical in the sense that macro-econ people have always thought about what those deep underlying resources on which a country's and its people's potential progress depend. So today, the understanding is that there's a set of natural capital, your assets of nature, certainly your farmland, but also a stable climate, an atmosphere that doesn't kill you when you breathe it, soils that your kids can play in without getting toxic shock syndrome, and so forth and so on. Manufactured capital, that's our built environment, and there the question is whether we've built it in ways that, while transporting us from point A to point B, poison the air with lots of wastes, or get us there in a reasonably efficient and clean and healthy way. The cities we build, I'll come back to in a minute. Human capital, both an end in itself, healthy people, but also a means of getting there. People are doing better at producing well-being when they're educated, when they're healthy, and peculiarly, other things being equal, when there are more of them. So the population debate actually comes in here, says, except that you're maybe having to divide a small pie in even smaller places, more people, by this logic, actually ought to be good for improving well-being, as indeed the old land, labor, and capital arguments suggested it was. Knowledge capital being the stock of what we know about the world, that we're not all having to start each generation from scratch. Crucially and increasingly in present times, this knowledge capital is really understood to be our capacity to innovate, to figure out problems we've encountered, and in a pretty timely and effective way, figure workarounds. And whether those are GMO crops, or windmill producers of electricity, or high-speed trains, the crucial thing is sustainable development in general requires that we get more good out of the world we have, while generating fewer bads. And though institutions, that is rules, regulations, taxes, have a lot to do with that, the crucial thing is our ability to innovate our way forward. So you want to ask about a country's and a world's capacity for innovation. Finally, social capital is certainly the ability to have the rule of law, contracts that work, taxing systems that penalize people for throwing garbage over the fence to somebody else, and so on. But it's also the deeper set of social norms, the things that some number hundreds of years ago, the norm was slavery is okay. That norm is almost extinct now, almost, sadly. In this country, back when the Brundtland Report was done, it would not be unusual to drive down the street out here and see somebody chucking garbage out the window of their car. At least in the better parts of Cambridge right now, you see much less of that. And nobody that you know would feel that chucking garbage out the window of the car as you go down the road would not earn them some social ostracization from people like you. So social norms matter, and the question is, how much of a set of norms relevant to sustainability behaviors do we have in place? How might you get more of them in place, and so on. So the argument is, those are the basic underlying assets, the modern land, labor, and capital, on which not a guarantee of improved well-being inclusively over the long run comes, but the potential for doing so. The potential is then mediated by how well we deploy it, and so on. And so what that does is lead us to two things. One is the beginning of a set of international systemic measures and accounts. Is if you started summing up with appropriate weights the manufactured capital, natural capital, human capital, and so on of different countries, and look how that changes through time, would you get patterns different than simply looking at, say, GNP through time? Answer, yes, which I'll show in a minute. Those accounts are not complete. They still don't have a really good way of including in the aggregate measures this knowledge capital and social capital, though that is work in progress. But these are now, these nation-to-nation comparisons are regularly published by the World Bank and the UN, and I'll show you a sample in a moment. How are you doing with the inclusive wealth or the inclusive value of these underlying capital assets? Are you just getting an increase in your cities by spending down your natural capital, or are you managing to husband both together at the same time? Those metrics are also being done increasingly at the corporate level, where the advances in corporate sustainability reporting have gone well beyond their origins in compliance reporting and sort of standard health and safety stuff, to a number of companies that now look pretty much like these national comparative accounts of countries that are going on. But I'm going to spare you that because I didn't get the whole day. This is a sample of the kinds of numbers that are coming out of those studies now. I picked on Venezuela because, as far as I knew, there was nobody registered for this conference from Venezuela. Is that still correct? Anyway, I didn't invent the numbers. Venezuela knows it has some problems. So what are the problems? Venezuela, this black line, is what this measure of their land, labor, and capital, their inclusive wealth, has been doing over the period from 1990 to 2008. But it is an aggregate of these components. And so what you see is that Venezuela has been doing an admirable and effective job in investing in people. That is, their human capital has gone up as they've radically increased literacy rates and the delivery of public health. And they've done a really fine job of that, in some ways better than this country and others in the laggard West. They've done that, however, at the price of both an underinvestment in their physical capital, that is their manufactured capital. It's, for those who work with Venezuela, a well-known problem that they are not as well off as they were 10 years ago in terms of their factories, their transportation systems, especially their electricity and water distribution systems. Those, like those in America, have been allowed to decay. Earlier investments of an earlier generation have not been kept up, and so that's been drawing down the stock. But above all of that, Venezuela has radically drawn down its natural capital. That's not just the oil reserves that it's sold overseas. That is the really quite appalling destruction of its forests, coastlines, and so on, which has been, frankly, the consequence of neglect, non-attention, and the inability of groups concerned with these things to get their voice heard in the political process. And figures like this then exist for perhaps 25 countries now in the UN system, and they're done for about 120 in the slightly simpler World Bank system. If you take all those numbers together, Here are the charts that simply signify countries by whether this inclusive capital, this measure of sustainability, has been going up, which is what you want, holding steady, which is just sustainable but not great, or going down. And though you're doing, this is counterintuitive, you're doing fine is the greens, you're holding your own maybe is the grays, and you're sinking like a rock is the dark browns. So you see Venezuela pops up as not too good. We have a couple of countries that are headed down fast. Perhaps the surprise is that China, by these metrics, has a very positive growth rate in its integrated land, labor, and capital. That is, if you take even the dreadful pollution going on in China, the metrics for 1990 through 2008 say that their undoubted degradation of their environment, their soils, their atmosphere, and so on, has been just offset by their huge investments in built capital and in, above all, human capital. Again, they've done even better than Venezuela did in improving the education and public health available to their citizens. Now, that said, for all of you who have been in China recently, this doesn't make any sense. And so there's a warning here. First, it says our metrics may not be all they're cracked up to be yet. We may be missing things. We certainly are. Second, it says that the past doesn't guarantee the future. Our teams that have just come back from work with the Chinese government, the big change in the last couple of years is they are not, they're happy with the progress they made over the last 20 years. They're completely terrified by the situation they're in right now. The argument being that we have let pollution and degradation of the environment get so far out ahead of us, so completely affecting the lives of our citizens, that degradation and the state's inability to deal with it is the single largest threat to security of the Chinese state and certainly to its sitting governments. So these metrics are important. They're a step forward, but they have to be taken carefully, and if we ran that up to 2012, I think what you would be seeing is the Chinese themselves saying, holy mackerel, not so fast, hold the celebration. Yeah?
They just really call it Germany, which is striking me.
Same issue. If you actually did the disaggregation we did for Venezuela, you would certainly see a natural capital going down as it continues to do pollution, degradation, and so on. Not nearly as fast as it was back in the 50s or 60s. But you would see a substantial investment in infrastructure, in transportation nets, and so on. And these are, remember, these are net numbers across those assets. But the argument is whether these particular numbers will eventually be revised and come out differently. We are trying to get now an integrated view, which does something that has been the big complaint about sustainability arguments forever, which is that they sort of sound like the first farmer who came in and cleared a hectare of, say, primeval forest in Germany back in the whatevers, in the Nibelungen sites, was thereby screwing up the environment, and that couldn't be sustainable. And that obviously makes no sense at all. Human well-being, one sort of intuits, went up when that plenitude of forest had a hunk hacked out of it that let people begin to grow food, raise families, build villages, build community life, and so on. Fast forward that, you also would like a set of metrics so that when the last hectare of old-growth forest in Germany is chopped down for a parking lot of McDonald's, that this is looked upon as probably not a net contribution to human well-being over the long run. So it is a trade-off. It is trying to say it makes no sense to have a view of sustainability that does not let us use the environment and its resources, even sometimes degrade it from its pristine case. What is important is that we look at that degradation as actually being a cost and make sure that we're getting benefits to society, ours and other people's, that are commensurate with that damage, that we're including all the damages, not just the sale price of the real estate when we do that parking lot sale, And that's the trick of where a whole bunch of environmental economics is going today. A lot of countries are involved in trying to do better valuation, but it's not with a view of saying, stop using the environment. It's saying, use it more wisely, recognize that there are limits to how much of it you can get rid of before it bites back and causes you trouble, and so on. Okay? So, yes?
Good question. Everybody is completely fascinated about growth, but what's the map of the absolute value of inclusive wealth? Is it very different?
It's different. The book, The Inclusive Wealth Report, is readily accessible on the web. But the crucial thing is our working definition of sustainable development today. It's an odd idea, because what it says is for development to be sustainable, doesn't mean it's optimal, doesn't mean we're improving well-being as fast as we might. It says that this aggregate set, the fuel in the tank, is not going down. Okay? And so sustainability is a much milder criteria than who's doing best in growth rates. It's simply saying, are you sustaining the amount of resource, of fuel in the tank, or is it depleting? Okay? And so in a sense, in that sense, simply indicating the positives and the negatives turns out to be a useful thing. But the numbers themselves compute values. Now, I don't, there is a long lecture which I have to give in this, short course 2 days from now on pulling apart these metrics and comparing them to things like the Human Development Index and GNP indices. I'm going to resist doing those now. Hope I can stream through to the end and then open up the discussion for those of you who are number freaks in the after action and when I can get some coffee. So let me move on with simply this. So China is sustainable as a warning that though we are vastly better off in measuring key fundamental determinants of sustainability today than we were even 10 years ago, much less a generation ago, it is not a foolproof one, and like all measures, needs to be taken with several grains of something. Okay, but now let's for the moment postulate that an analytic system that tried to think about your fuel tank, your underlying asset base on which you could build long-term well-being, consisting of some way of aggregating these natural capital, human capital, manufactured capital, social capital, and knowledge capital. If that were true, then one of the things you want to do as an analyst of the prospects for sustainability is look at what the threats to substantial degradation in each of those is individually, and then of course look at their interactions and look at what the causes or the threats or the risks of degradation are to the fuel tank, the fuel in the tank as an aggregate. So let me do that. And what I want to do is just go through one slide each on each of those sets of capital and give you an indication of where current analysis, again, much of it going on in international organizations, in the UN system, some of it going in the independent scholarly community, but this being my particular cut on what the biggest current threats to the contribution of each of those asset classes to sustainable development averaged around the world are. And these would be different for individual countries or regions for sure. But the logic probably works. So I think without any question, the biggest threat on the natural capital side is nature's provision of a climate that humans had evolved in and that we're relatively well adapted to is going down the tubes very quickly. Human-caused climatic change is now an established truth. It is big, it is human-caused, and it is absolutely and inalterably irreversible. Geoengineering may slow it down, it does not stop it. We are coming off essentially 5,000 years of pretty equitable climate, and we are pulling the plug on it. And this will affect everyone everywhere. We see present damages as well as projected future damages to agriculture, to coastal areas, to public health, to the parts of California that are burning up 4 months earlier than they're supposed to burn up, and so on and so on. You all have been running into the literatures on that. The particular impacts differ by country and region, but the impacts are big and they're going to get bigger and they're really scary. Unfortunately, they're not the most scary things happening. Biodiversity is collapsing around the world. You say, well, okay, I'd rather have a world with pandas and things with eyelashes and big eyes in it, but who cares? The answer is, it turns out we care a lot. That in ways we do not understand enough to manage in any fine-tuned sense a relatively diverse biota. That doesn't mean you have to save every species, but it means that one species agricultural systems, doing everything on wheat, or a one kind of cow, or for that matter, a one kind of tiger world, are a very bad bet. One disease wipes them out. One new pest species imported from elsewhere wipes them out. They are prone to huge cycles and fluctuations, and the thing biodiversity gets us, if nothing else, is a damping of those fluctuations, a degree of predictability and stability, not just in what species are out there, but in this whole set of environmental services we get from them. Cleaning of the air, stabilizing of the climate, repression of disease organisms, and so on and so on. And the utterly unprecedented collapse of biodiversity around the world is a huge threat to a whole set of environmental services we've taken for granted. Maybe, and people have been hearing about that, that was in fact one of the motivations behind the Brundtland report, but we now appreciate how many functions of society are tied up with this. The trick is to get away from arguments that say we have to preserve this particular species or this particular place, and understand that it is the ensemble of species richness and the patchiness, having patches of nature interspersed with patches of cities and so on, that turns out, as we're beginning to understand it, to be the essential thing to giving us this stability in service delivery. A piece that 5 years ago I certainly wouldn't have been talking about in this room, but I think is increasingly preoccupying most of us. This biodiversity isn't just what's happening out there in the rainforests. It's what every one of you is carrying around in your gut. That is the diversity of the internal flora and fauna that make your digestive system, your whole body's immune system work, is also a biodiverse community, or it once was a biodiverse community. It is simply amazing what is being discovered about how the health of that microbial community, its diversity and its composition, has huge things to do, not just with whether you get traveler's diarrhea or not, but with your immune system, with whether you get asthma, with whether you get obese, and so forth and so on. Some totally scary stuff on the wings of how our disruption of the microbiota in our own guts, mostly through overuse of antibiotics, but also through weird things we have voluntarily put in our food that we eat, has been radically reducing that biodiversity and leading to a whole set of autoimmune responses that we're only beginning to track out. And that is not normally what people talk about when they talk about biodiversity, but it belongs right there. Finally, toxins. I ran for the White House about 10 years ago, the first national effort to actually put together all the data in the country to do a report on the state of the health of the nation's ecosystems. Big deal. No one's ever heard of it again. It was to be Al Gore's way of demonstrating that he, in his presidency, was improving the state of the environment, and he just left one small issue out of that. So we didn't have a president to report to, and the next guy didn't want to hear about the state of the environment, so this thing sits on a shelf. What totally freaked me out was we actually got together measurements from every stream down to fifth order, which means the little brooks you played in as a kid in the United States. Not a single one of those did not have measurable levels of nasty toxins that nature did not put there in them. At least one. 90% of the streams had at least 5. That is, there was no clean stream left anywhere in the United States. They all had levels of toxins that we know to be bad for living things in them. Okay? It doesn't necessarily mean don't let your kid play in the streams, but it means it ain't the stream you grew up playing in. Take that a step forward to the other end. I posed this question to a meeting of the Board of Governors of the World Wildlife Fund a couple of years ago. What did they think was going to kill the last polar bear? Because sure as anything, polar bears, except in zoos, are on their way to extinction. And I gave them a test. They should have known about this stuff. My argument was it is probably not any of the usual suspects, but it's going to be dementia. it will be because the polar bears become so stupid that they don't know how to swim or catch things even if the things were still there. Why will they become stupid? Because the levels of mercury and heavy metals building up in their brain tissue, they're top predators like we are, at the top of the food chain. The Arctic has been a place that the heavy metals, mostly released by fossil fuel burning around the world, accumulate. Many of you will have heard that maybe the Roman civilization collapsed because of too much lead in the pipes. These civilizations, and many like them at the top of their food chains, i.e. us, have levels of cadmium, mercury, vanadium, a bunch of heavy metals in our tissue today that we know results in substantial declines in things like measured IQ, cognitive capacity, and so on. There is totally scary stuff out there about how when, for instance, Chicago, city of Chicago, banned lead in gasoline, you could watch then the amount of lead in the blood tissue of kids go down, and with a 20-year lag, the kids growing up, this is when it's young kids that get the neuro damage from these metals. 20 years later, when those kids should have been hoodlums, as you got the lead out, the criminality rates, the rates of gang violence and so on, tracked the demise, the extraction of lead with a virtually perfect correlation. And there's good physiology to back that up. The bears are doomed, one might well argue, because of the lead we've put in their heads, not because of the climate we warmed for them or the hunting we do of them. And it's not just the bears. Okay, so what are the threats to human capital? Persisting malnutrition resulting in lower life expectancy. This is simply a table of life expectancy for people born in the year on the horizontal axis. And the point is that there are several points here. The first is that the gap between the lowest performing regions of the world and the highest performing has been getting narrower, from 32 years back in 1950, something close to 27 years today. So that's real progress. But the point is that the less well-nourished, and that turns out to be almost certainly the causal link underlying this, those who turn out to be less well-nourished and less healthy, more exposed to disease organisms, persistently have a quarter century less of a life to lead than the luckiest of us. And when you think about whatever it is you want to determine well-being is, chopping 25 years off of what somebody's well-being might be, simply because they were malnourished and faced a particularly aggressive disease plateau, disease array in their first 3 years of life, is arguably the single biggest assault on human well-being and the single biggest gap to be closed that we might contemplate. Add to that threat coming through human capital, the rise of new diseases, not the ones that are causing those differences or contributing to them, but two classes, the increasing incidence of spillovers from human contact with animals. HIV/AIDS is the lead example of that, but Ebola, which we're just seeing a new outbreak of, is another one. Why are these new or seeming more plentiful now? Because frankly, humans are living in parts of the biosphere they've never lived in before. The rates of contact between people and animals harboring stuff the animals have become accustomed to but are lethal to humans are growing. That's not just in odd tropical countries. It's true in the areas surrounding Phoenix, our fastest growing city. Whereas people get out a bit into the desert, they encounter some of these cute little gerbil jumping rats, which harbor hantavirus and a whole bunch of things we never had as diseases. And we're getting those. So we have a whole bunch of spillovers as we force ourselves into interaction with the animal community. And then we have these chronic metabolic diseases I referred to earlier. Everybody's noticed the rise of obesity, of asthma, and so on. We're beginning to understand that those new diseases, as I say, link back to our changes in diet, our use of antibiotics, and so on. Wherever they're coming from, they are a major threat to any notion of well-being driven directly through human capital. What about threats running through the manufactured capital channel? One that sobers me up most is what might be really exciting to you as an investor is that we're going to build within the lifetimes of people in this room over the next 30 years as much urban infrastructure as we have built in all of human history up till now. Literally going to double the urban infrastructure, plus or minus some number of percent. That is a very large manufacturing project. Problem is, to the extent that we develop it this way, which is one of the natural ways for it to go, we do it without even the most rudimentary services of sewage disposal, waste treatment, provision of health services, and the like. And we know from our own history here and in Europe that those public health service provisions are probably the single greatest contribution to health and well-being that you get as you build cities. We're not doing it right now, and we don't, nobody has the plan for how all these massive amounts of urban growth are going to happen. That's an almost unaddressed, certainly unsolved threat. These are problems that are much smaller when people are dispersed over the countryside. They literally are new problems as we move 80% of the world's population into cities over the next 30 years. That's what we will be, and we don't even understand how you would build urban infrastructures to deal with that. We see in contemporary China the problem of just letting this go, even in a quite advanced society, as I related earlier. So look, everybody grew cities with a lot of pollution. Pittsburgh, the Ruhrgebiet, and so on and so on. They got rich while getting dirty, and then they cleaned up by being rich. The difference in China is not that they're the only ones who ever had pollution in their cities. It's that they got so big so fast that the pollution levels have gotten way out of control. They've gotten in control, so as I say, today, the Chinese government itself is concerned about pollution as being the single greatest threat to its own security, because it can't protect its people from it. Many of you know that it's increasingly hard to get senior executives from multinational companies to to actually to live in Beijing or the other highly polluted cities of China, simply because it is so debilitating to them, and most wouldn't even consider taking their families there. This is not a great way to become the new development hub of the world, and that is dawning on the Chinese, not just the Chinese. All these rapidly growing areas, the ones that are generating many of the elements of improved well-being, but finding that they got too far out of whack with doing the added investments necessary to keep the pollution under control. So that is a big threat. The Chinese will probably get a pretty good handle on it because they have a better ability than many to get things done. Not an unlimited ability, but a better one than many. What is totally scary is for the states that are growing fast, that is, the economic boom is there, but the governance capacity is even less than it is in China. Okay, knowledge capital. In a sense, the reason that Malthus wasn't right when he said growing populations were going to kill us all was because we were very good innovators. We kept figuring ways to get more crops grown on the same amount of soil, to get more power out of individual laborers in agriculture, and thus the threatened famines mostly didn't happen. We invested hugely in a green revolution as a great international outpouring of investments in an ability to, around the world, grow new crops that people needed not to starve to death, not commercialize them, not sell them. They were open, no property rights, and so forth. We're not doing anything like that today. Investments in innovation systems to deliver public goods, as opposed to the private goods that corporations sensibly and properly focus on, has decayed radically from the state it was 10, 20, or 30 years ago. We have passed the era when we seem willing to invest in international or globally directed R&D to address the so-called neglected diseases, the neglected crops, the neglected problems of getting sanitation infrastructure into rapidly developing cities. No one's going to make $1 on that stuff, or at least we haven't figured out a market plan for that yet. And given that, we're not finding taxpayers willing to invest public money in it. That is then compounded by the fact that many industries are finding that indeed innovation is the route to the future, They are employing more and more researchers, engineers, innovators within them. But what that means, so like if I just take an example of the area I work in, which is international agriculture, we met with the head of Monsanto's R&D division, thinking how they might work with the international Green Revolution crop people. And it was a shock to all concerned when we discovered, when the Monsanto guy said, I've just looked at your International Research Institute's budget numbers. They're a rounding error in my R&D budget. So everything we are investing in the international scene, across all countries, across the World Bank and agriculture, for these neglected crops on which the survival of many people around the world depends, is a rounding error in Monsanto's R&D budget. That is indicative of how much the expertise in pharmaceuticals, in agriculture, in energy is now in the private sector. And the challenge to us is, not that that isn't a good thing, that's producing all sorts of neat stuff as well as some not so neat stuff, but it means those investigators are not going off to be the Green Revolution scientists doing public goods production. And we have not been really very clever in figuring out public-private partnerships that allow corporations following what they must do in response to their stock payers, stock buyers, to also invest in helping to produce the public goods that are so needed. And so that's the super challenge, is not to move the innovators out of industry. It is to find ways that industry can share them with society without undermining its own legitimacy in order to move these things along. There's some neat stories happening there, but they're small and nowhere near big enough to deal with the challenges we face. That academia might be your sort of court of last resort, but it's increasingly not. More so than even when I was in school. Even this university, sadly, is remorselessly stovepiping itself. We're telling our freshmen, Kevin, help us, that they need to be narrowing down their focus, getting really good at something so that they're essentially not just doing pre-law and pre-med, they're doing pre-investment banker, pre-this, they are becoming specialists. Specialists are really useful in the world, but they're mostly useful for advancing particular professions and the disciplines around which big universities are built. They're not particularly good for solving the kind of interlinked problems, designing solutions to these sorts of problems. Under our current president, through Faust, we have had a dawning of a pretty new day here. We are being encouraged to work across the departments, across the universities. Of course, I'm teaching the freshmen is caused huge distress among the bureaucrats, but great joy in the president's office because they couldn't figure out whether it was a natural science course or a social science course or a humanities course, and therefore they didn't know which column to put it in the catalog. She blessedly intervened and said, that is not a problem. It went into all three of the catalogs. We're beginning to do this, but we are not nearly close enough, and we are just, it seems to me, criminally pushing our young people to be little pillars in the game rather than to explore both for the joy, the challenge of it, and because we need them in this big interactive market. Finally, social capital, that is our governance structures, our ability to coordinate activities across private sector and public sector, across the company that produces the wastes and the country that ends up getting the wastes, and so on and so on. We need that. We need it particularly because of the transnational and transgenerational character of business as usual, driven by current day economics and so on. And that's in a time when, so we need active government intervention, but around the world, particularly in democracies that have, over the last 50 years, tended to be the leaders in introducing international or transnational laws and regulations and norms to address these sorts of inequities, the trust in those governments is plummeting. These are data from the United States, going back to the time of Eisenhower and Kennedy, and remorselessly driving itself down. We decided we would trust Mr. Bush just after the 9/11 attacks, but rapidly found that that wasn't what we were prepared to keep doing. The point is we have so little trust in our government relative to what it was doing when it was creating the interstate highway system, creating the Peace Corps, and so on, that one has to really worry when one thinks but we need governance that can handle these problems of us versus the future, of us versus other countries, of us versus other neighborhoods. And it's not just us. On this thing, the dark reds are very low trust in government. The dark greens are very high trust in government. Again, tell me about it. The survey question says, when Chinese say, do you trust that your government will do what it says it's going to do? Their answer is yes. They don't like it. But these are actually pretty carefully done survey questions. In the United States, in much of Europe today, when saying, do you trust your government will do what it says it's going to do? The answer is no. Do you trust that it has your interests at heart? The answer is no. Now, again, you can quibble with the data, but you can't make up your own data of what you think it really ought to be like. And this decline in the countries that have tended to take on a responsibility for helping the world to solve world problems just rather than just advancing their own agendas, that trust tanking at the same time that trust in governments that we sometimes have not had the global, anyway, you figure it out. It is not great news. Okay, so the situation of, if those are the threats, what is a sensible person to do other than just go screaming off the bridge, and so on and so on. Screaming off the bridge is not necessarily the worst option. Quite seriously, I mean, there's a way of looking at those threats and the consequences of them that would lead sensible people today to say, why would I have a kid? Now, that is the logic that you would have expected to have had nobody having kids during the Second World War in Europe and so on. Lots of people have kids. Who knows? The point is, it is pretty grim news. The question is, what is a sensible, determined, idealistic person to do? So we learned a couple of things. And I'm going to claim back my 7 minutes that I gave to get everybody in the room. One, I think we're learning enough about how the actual world, rather than the pretend market world of perfect markets in the textbooks, actually works, to say we should think about interventions differently. One is we just should stop talking about the natural world and how we're perturbing it. There is no natural world. Remember my account of the streams are full, even in the US, the streams are full of junk. Europe's been at it 1,000 years longer than we have. Their streams are really full of junk. The polar bear is full of junk. The climate has been altered by humans. There is no nature left. What there is a coupled system of human society and the rest of the world that is interacting. That's not a bad thing necessarily. It just means we reshape nature, nature reshapes us. It's complicated. You can't just do one thing. People like me were really enthusiastic 5-7 years ago. The idea of biofuels as an alternative to fossil fuels, and we jumped on that bandwagon only to determine that by mandating biofuels, what we did was cause price spikes that caused food riots and starvation in much of the developing world. You can't just do one thing. The second piece, it's adaptive. That is, nature always bites back. Yes, you can invent antibiotics that kill off germs, but the germs look at that and say, oh, we believe in natural selection. So we'll select out a bit, and 10 years from now, we'll have a bunch of germs that just totally laugh at, or even better, they eat your antibiotics and prosper on it. Again, not a reason not to do antibiotics, but a reason to be more careful with them and to recognize that when we push on nature, nature pushes back. Acting accordingly. Let me finish then, just so this doesn't look like the standard lecture by an academic who says the world is terrible, but there's nothing to do. 4 things to do, then I will stop. First one is don't meet your energy needs with fossil fuels, period. This table comes from probably the most careful group of economists in the United States. Rick Mendelsohn, Bill Nordhaus, Nick Muller down at Yale, sadly, who computed across the United States over the recent times simply for a whole bunch of industrial sectors, if you added up all the benefits they gave to society, so by providing us energy that we use to run our cars and run our factories, providing jobs, and all the damages through pollution that had affected health, affected, dissolving our cell phone towers because of acidity, damaged our agriculture. And then this thing is their ratio of the gross environmental damage over the economic value added to society. And you will get it, this is a sustainability number. This basically, when that number is larger than 1, it says the damages on a given day that you do this activity one more day, society is digging itself deeper in a hole. The damages are greater than the benefits you get from it. And that's not true for everything. There's a whole bunch of stuff like carbon black manufacturing and livestock and so on, which are not totally clean actors by any sense, but we get more benefits from those than we get from some other stuff. And look who sits up in the positive number category here. Solid waste combustion and incineration, petroleum-fired electric power, coal-fired electric power, dimensions, da-da-da-da-da. These are all things in which the lesson is pretty clear. If you're in a hole, stop digging. If every day you burn another ton of fossil fuel to produce electricity leaves you worse off than you were the day before, maybe don't do it anymore. It's bad for people and other living things. And we got to get that message right. This isn't just climate change. This is killing you with fine particulates. It's killing your crops with ozone. It's dissolving your cell phone towers with acidity. All these favors that fossil fuels give to you. Okay, second big lesson. Take the weird animal that has emerged as our modern so-called food system and isn't really about food, but is about generating calories and selling them to people in oversupply, which sounds a lot like heroin addiction. That is, it gives you a momentary surge of good and long-term very bad consequences. And think about how different it would be if it were actually a nutrition system. That is something designed to benefit human well-being broadly, rather than the benefits of a big food sector that has, some of my best friends are Aggies, but it is truly hard how much they have pushed marketing, especially of the sort of corn-based sugar economy, in ways that are identical to what happened in the tobacco industry. They have opposed the science. They have put political pressure to bear on stopping us from doing reforms. Keep the habit. Even Homer Simpson figured out that what we were essentially doing was boiling down donuts and then shooting up on them. That was what the modern food system was about. We need a nutrition system. We sort of got this right. And of number 2 of 4, we got to move in that direction. Third one is that we radically reduce the use of biocides. Biocides kill biotic things. When we use them as pesticides, they kill pollinators, predators, and children. They also kill bad pests. It doesn't say don't ever use them. It says be really sparing because they're killing life which we depend on. Herbicides, they are the source of most of the problems we have in our drinking water. They are damaging ecosystems. They are undermining the whole functional capacity of ecosystems to deliver all these free services we've gotten used to. And probably the worst of all, antibiotics are biocides. They should be handled on the shelf right alongside the weed killer and the pest killer. Again, it's not that I wouldn't be alive if it weren't for antibiotics. But I would be alive if it weren't for 99% of the antibiotics used in a given day to make cows get fast faster, to prophylactically treat viruses because doctors would prefer to give you a pill, to trying to explain to you that viruses don't respond to antibiotics, and this is stupid. And because nature fights back, we get resistance building up. People are now talking about an antibiotic winter. Any of you who work with hospitals know that they are on the verge of hysterics about how many of the nasties running through their hospitals right now do not respond to anything at all in their antibiotic arsenal. If we come up to a time when it was like pre-antibiotics, talk to your parents or grandparents, if they're still around, about what that world was like. And then add on to that this new disease phenomena, the things where we are turning up with asthmas and obesities and so on because of the second and third order impacts of this overdosing of antibiotics on our own internal stuff. And finally, my fourth priority is we've got to figure out ways, we have to support the measures that people are proposing to reduce the inequalities in consumption out there. Why? Inequalities in consumption are at the level we've got them today. This is the 1% or the 10th of a percent or the 100th of a percent versus everybody else. are first horrible because everybody else doesn't have enough in so much of the world. But beyond that, they result in natural capital degradation. Indira Gandhi told us back in 1972 that there were two big causes of environmental disruption. One was too much wealth and too much poverty. And relative to the 1972 situation, what do we have? We have much more too much wealth and much more too much poverty, rather than having moved towards that middle ground. They are a cause of human capital degradation. Big part of the world exists on too little food and other stuff to consume, energy, clean water, and the like. A little part of the world is existing, if only temporarily, on too much food stuff, getting fat and obese, too much stuff in general. So that's not doing us any good. And above all, maybe, I'm saying how the one thing we need is restoring trust in governance. The notion of trying to restore trust in governance at a time that it is tolerating the rapidly accelerating gap between the very, very high consumers and everyone else in a world where it is just conspicuously clear that, that most of the everybody else does not have enough to get by in pushing a well-being, a prosperity for their own. Governments who are unable to intervene to deal with that situation, how can they possibly have our trust when they ask us to do carbon taxes in order to begin to address the climate issue, or additional costs on our electronics that the wastes don't end up piling up in countries that have no choice but to take them as a source of income? So I see this gap as not just a threat to the normal things, but a threat to our entire credibility of governance, which the need for is increasing. So who's doing sustainable development? Lots of people. These are just places we work in at Harvard. Going from plantation oil palms in Indonesia to mixed agroecological sites that build on diversity, generate sustainable incomes. The Clean Cities movement started in Europe, now beginning to catch on in the US. That's a part of their complete streets notion of recovering the inner parts of cities for the biota, people, pedestrians, walkways, kids, rather than just automobiles. We see it in corporations like Unilever's announcement of its new corporate marketing strategy 2 weeks ago, in which they, taking a leaf from Henry Ford, declared they just decided that Unilever, these guys are big food processing and so on folks, that fully 2/3 of the market they would ever see was in the poor part of the world that couldn't right now afford their products. So they were committing themselves as of now to providing wages all the way down their supply chains that would make the people supplying the goods they sell to you and me sufficiently well off that those people could buy the goods too. And that they would do so in a manner that was environmentally sustainable, so that they weren't just investing in a community that 10 years from now would be bankrupt. Totally remarkable piece. John Ruggie's session, Jay Nelson's session yesterday, talked about that in detail because they had a lot to do with building it up as part of this corporate social responsibility movement around the world. And then we've been active with the Chinese as part of their efforts to say, we're even more siloed than you. Help us to design energy strategies that emphasize our wind resources, our water resources, and so on, so that we can begin to get ourselves out of this hole we've dug ourselves into. The point is, there are efforts being made to advance sustainability going on pretty well everywhere you look, though nowhere enough and nowhere comprehensively enough. So I'll leave us with this, for those who are US and old, a very famous cartoon in the Pogo series. Pogo, the beauty of the forest primeval, gets me in the heart, gets me in the feet. It's hard walking on this junk. This is the disposed rubbish of an over-consuming society. Yes, son, we've met the enemy and he is us. So what I want to close with is the notion that ultimately it's us. David Elwood and Drew emphasized over the last 2 days, you are here because you are leaders of the world, either now or shortly to be there as you get out of the Kennedy School. We're setting examples. The companies we run, the countries we advise, the countries we lead, the communities we sit in. And so it's fine that Unilever and the European energy people and so on are pointing the way. But I think the question is for each of us, what can we as individuals, as corporate leaders, as voters do in each of those agendas, and how many of them did we actually do this week? That's what I face each day, partly courtesy of my wife who reminds me when I forget. And I think pretty much is what all of us need to do with this agenda is to move towards prosperity that is sustainable over the long run. So